In the shadow of Whitehall Palace, behind locked doors that have guarded royal secrets for 4 centuries, lies a truth so scandalous it could have toppled the British crown. King James I, ruler of England and Scotland, the man who gave us the Bible that bears his name, harbored a forbidden love so consuming, so dangerous, that he risked everything for it. Tonight, we unlock the vault of history's most explosive royal secret. Picture this: a king, trembling as he writes love letters by candlelight, his words dripping with passion that could destroy him. "I naturally so love your person and delight so much in your company," he wrote to his beloved George Villiers, "that I cannot be happy if you are not near me." These weren't the words of a monarch to his courtier. These were the desperate confessions of a man enslaved by forbidden desire. But here's what history books won't tell you. James didn't just love George Villiers, he was obsessed with him, consumed, destroyed by him. This wasn't some fleeting royal fancy. This was a love affair so intense, so all-consuming, that it would reshape the very foundations of the British monarchy and ultimately lead to consequences that would echo through centuries. The letters, hidden for generations in royal archives, reveal a king on the edge of madness. "Christ had his John, and I have my George," James wrote in words that would have been his death sentence if discovered by his enemies. In an age when homosexuality was punishable by death, when the very thought of such love was considered an abomination before God, the King of England was risking not just his crown, but his life, for the touch of a man 22 years his junior. Imagine the terror that consumed him every night, the constant fear of discovery, the weight of leading a double life so profound that every public appearance was a performance, every royal decree a mask hiding his true self. James lived in a prison of his own making, where love was treason and authenticity meant death. The psychological torment was unbearable. Court records show James would fly into violent rages when separated from Villiers, then weep uncontrollably when reunited. Ambassadors described a king who seemed to live in 2 worlds, the public monarch who ruled with divine authority, and the private man who begged for the affection of a beautiful courtier who held more power over him than any parliament ever could. This is the story of a love that defied every law of God and man, a passion so forbidden it could have destroyed the monarchy itself. A relationship that proved even kings are slaves to their hearts, no matter how dangerous the consequences. If you're ready to discover the shocking truth about the king who lived a double life, who loved in shadows while ruling in light, then join me on this journey into the forbidden chambers of royal history. Subscribe now, because what you're about to hear will change everything you thought you knew about power, passion, and the price of living authentically in a world that demands conformity. But first, let me tell you about the lonely boy who would become the most conflicted king in British history, and how his desperate hunger for love would make him the perfect target for the most beautiful and dangerous man in England. To understand how a king could risk everything for forbidden love, we must first journey back to the beginning, to a childhood so traumatic it would shape every desperate decision James would make as a man. Born in 1566 into the blood-soaked world of Scottish royalty, James Stuart entered life as an unwanted heir to a throne built on murder, betrayal, and secrets that would haunt him forever. His father, Lord Darnley, was brutally murdered when James was barely 8 months old, blown up in a house that was set ablaze to hide the evidence of strangulation. His mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, became the prime suspect in her husband's assassination. Imagine growing up knowing that your mother might have orchestrated your father's death. The psychological scars ran deeper than any physical wound could ever reach. By the age of 1, James was already King of Scotland, but he was also utterly alone, torn from his mother's arms and placed in the care of cold, calculating nobles who saw him as a political pawn rather than a vulnerable child. James learned early that love was a luxury he could never afford. The Earl of Mar became his guardian, a stern Presbyterian who believed that sparing the rod spoiled the child. James was beaten for showing emotion, punished for seeking affection, trained to suppress every human instinct that made him vulnerable. Picture this lonely little boy, sitting in the drafty halls of Stirling Castle, watching other children play while he studied Latin and theology. He was forbidden from forming attachments, denied the simple comfort of a mother's embrace or a father's guidance. The only love he knew came from books, poetry, literature, anything that could transport him from the cold reality of his existence. But here's the devastating truth that shaped everything. James wasn't just physically isolated, he was emotionally starved. Every night he went to sleep knowing that everyone around him had an agenda, that every smile was calculated, every kindness performed. The hunger for genuine human connection grew inside him like a cancer, creating a void so deep that when love finally came, he would be powerless to resist it, no matter how dangerous. The psychological damage was irreversible. Court physicians noted that young James would rock himself to sleep, often talking to imaginary companions. He developed a stutter that would plague him throughout his life, a physical manifestation of the terror he felt when trying to express his true feelings. Touch became both his greatest craving and his deepest fear. As he grew older, the isolation only intensified. Scottish nobles used him as a puppet, forcing him to sign documents he couldn't understand, manipulating his desperate need for approval. They taught him that showing weakness was fatal, that trust was a liability, that love was a weapon his enemies would use to destroy him. By his teenage years, James had learned to perform kingship, but he had never learned to be human. He was a master of political theater, but couldn't recognize authentic emotion. This made him the perfect victim for manipulation, the ideal target for someone who understood that the greatest power over a starved man isn't food, it's the promise of love. The boy who would become king carried these wounds into every relationship, every decision, every moment of his adult life. The desperate hunger for connection that his childhood created would eventually lead him to George Villiers and into the most dangerous love affair in royal history. But before that fateful meeting, James had to survive his early years on the throne, where the lessons of loneliness would teach him that sometimes the greatest kings are those who understand the true cost of power. When James ascended to the English throne in 1603, uniting Scotland and England under one crown, the world saw the triumph of a brilliant king. But behind the pageantry and celebrations lay a man drowning in the weight of expectations, suffocating under the mask he was forced to wear every single day. The coronation that made him the most powerful monarch in Europe also sealed his fate as the loneliest man in the kingdom. Picture James in those early years of his English reign, surrounded by hundreds of courtiers, yet utterly isolated. Every morning, he would wake to the suffocating ritual of royal protocol. Servants who couldn't look him in the eye, nobles who bowed but never truly saw him, advisors who spoke in riddles and half-truths. He was King James I of England, but he was also a prisoner in his own palace, trapped by the very power that was supposed to set him free. The psychological pressure was unbearable. James was expected to be the perfect Protestant king, the defender of the faith, the moral compass of the nation. But inside, he burned with desires that could destroy everything he had worked to build. Late at night, alone in his chambers, he would catch himself staring too long at the young men who served at court, feeling attractions that filled him with shame and terror. The guilt ate away at him like acid. He had been raised to believe that his desires were sinful, abominable in the eyes of God. Yet he couldn't stop himself from feeling what he felt. The internal war between duty and desire was tearing him apart. Court physicians noted his increasing bouts of melancholy, his violent mood swings, his inability to sleep without wine or laudanum. James tried everything to suppress his true nature. He threw himself into his marriage with Anne of Denmark, producing children to secure the succession. But even as he performed his royal duties in the marriage bed, his mind wandered to forbidden fantasies. The Queen herself noticed his distance, his inability to truly connect with her on any emotional level. Their relationship became a cold political arrangement, two actors playing roles they had never chosen. The pressure to maintain his public image was crushing. James became obsessed with his reputation, paranoid about rumors and whispers. He surrounded himself with spies and informants, desperate to know what people said about him behind closed doors. The fear of exposure consumed him. Every glance from a courtier felt like an accusation. Every whispered conversation seemed to hide his secret. But here's what made it even worse. James was brilliant. He wrote theological treatises, translated poetry, engaged in philosophical debates that impressed the greatest minds of Europe. His intelligence made him acutely aware of his own duplicity. He could analyze every aspect of statecraft and diplomacy, but he couldn't solve the riddle of his own heart. The loneliness became so acute that James began to crave any form of genuine human connection. He started showing favoritism to certain male courtiers, nothing overtly sexual, but enough to raise eyebrows. He would keep them close during meetings, seek their opinions on matters of state, find excuses to touch their shoulders or hands. These small intimacies were like drops of water to a man dying of thirst. Tell me in the comments what part of this story shocks you the most so far. James's internal struggle between desire and duty is something that resonates across centuries, but the price he paid for living this double life was higher than most of us could ever imagine. By 1614, James was a king at breaking point. 11 years of suppressing his true self had left him desperate, vulnerable and hungry for something real. He was a powder keg, waiting for the right spark to ignite. And that spark was about to arrive at court, in the form of a 21-year-old beauty who would change the course of British history forever. But George Villiers wasn't just any ordinary young man. He was calculated, ambitious, and dangerously beautiful. And he was about to exploit every weakness that years of royal loneliness had carved into James's heart. August 1614, the moment that would change the course of British history forever. Into the opulent halls of Whitehall Palace walked a young man so breathtakingly beautiful that hardened courtiers stopped mid-conversation to stare. George Villiers was 21 years old, with golden hair that caught the light like spun silk, piercing blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul, and a smile that could melt the resolve of the most powerful men in England. But behind that angelic face lay a calculating mind that understood exactly how to use beauty as a weapon. James first saw George during a royal hunt at Whitehall Palace. Picture this scene. The 48-year-old king, worn down by years of loneliness and suppressed desire, suddenly confronted by a vision of masculine perfection that took his breath away. George was serving as a cupbearer, a minor role that should have rendered him invisible among the crowd of courtiers. But James couldn't look away. For the first time in decades, the king felt his carefully constructed walls crumbling. What James didn't know was that George's appearance at court wasn't accidental. This beautiful young man from Leicestershire had been carefully groomed and positioned by a faction of nobles who understood the king's weaknesses better than James understood them himself. They had spent months preparing George for this moment, teaching him how to walk, how to speak, how to hold the king's gaze just long enough to be intriguing without seeming forward. The manipulation was masterful. George had been trained to be everything James had been denied in his loveless childhood. Where the king had known only cold formality, George offered warmth. Where James had faced only calculated interactions, George seemed to provide genuine affection. Every gesture was designed to fill the emotional void that had been carved into James's heart by decades of royal isolation. But here's the devastating truth. George wasn't just beautiful, he was brilliant. Within days of arriving at court, he had analyzed every aspect of James's personality, identified every vulnerability, mapped every pathway to the king's heart. George understood that James didn't just want a lover. He wanted a son, a friend, a confidant, someone who could see past the crown to the lonely man beneath. The psychological seduction began immediately. George would linger after formal presentations, asking thoughtful questions about theology and statecraft. He would quote poetry that James had written, claiming it had moved him deeply. He would touch the king's arm while speaking, brief contacts that sent electricity through James's starved nervous system. Each interaction was perfectly calibrated to deepen the king's emotional dependence. James was helpless against this assault on his defenses. The transformation in James was immediate and terrifying. Courtiers who had known the king for years watched in amazement as he became animated, almost youthful, in George's presence. The melancholy that had plagued James for decades seemed to lift. He smiled more, laughed louder, engaged more enthusiastically in court activities. It was as if George had breathed life back into a man who had been slowly dying of loneliness. Within weeks, George Villiers had accomplished what no courtier in James's reign had managed. He had made himself indispensable to the most powerful man in England. But this was only the beginning. George's ambition reached far beyond the king's bedchamber, and his rise through the ranks would be as meteoric as it was scandalous. The beautiful stranger was about to become the most hated man in England, and James was about to discover that the price of love could be higher than the cost of a kingdom. What happened next defied every rule of royal protocol and shocked the English court to its core. Within months of their first meeting, James began showering George with titles, lands, and honors at a pace that left seasoned courtiers speechless. The lowly cupbearer from Leicestershire was about to become the most powerful man in England after the king himself, and everyone knew exactly why. The transformation was breathtaking in its audacity. First, James made George a gentleman of the bedchamber, a position that gave him intimate daily access to the king. Then came Knight of the Order of the Garter, followed by Viscount Villiers, Earl of Buckingham, Marquess of Buckingham, and finally, Duke of Buckingham. In just 7 years, George rose from serving wine to wielding power that ancient noble families had spent centuries trying to achieve. But these weren't just empty titles. With each elevation came vast estates, enormous wealth, and political influence that threatened the very foundations of English aristocracy. James was literally reshaping the power structure of the kingdom to accommodate his beloved George. The king, who had once been so careful about royal dignity, was now openly flaunting his favoritism in a way that scandalized even the most liberal minds at court. The intimate rituals James created around George were unprecedented and deeply disturbing to traditional courtiers. Every morning, George would help the king dress, their hands touching as they arranged royal garments. James would insist that George taste his food before every meal, recreating their first meeting as cupbearer. During state ceremonies, James would position George beside him, sometimes touching his hand or whispering in his ear, while foreign ambassadors watched in horrified fascination. The letters from this period reveal the depth of James's obsession. "I cannot live without you," he wrote to George during a brief separation. "My heart and soul are where you are." These weren't the words of a king to his subject. These were the desperate pleadings of a man who had lost all sense of royal dignity in the face of consuming passion. James signed his letters, "Your dear dad and husband," a phrase that would have been scandalous if discovered by his enemies. The court watched this relationship unfold with a mixture of fascination and horror. James would cancel important state meetings to spend time with George. He would delay foreign ambassadors if George was late to court. The business of ruling England became secondary to the emotional needs of a king who had finally found someone who made him feel truly alive. But George's rapid rise created dangerous enemies. Ancient families who had held power for generations watched in fury as this beautiful nobody accumulated wealth and influence that dwarfed their own. The traditional nobility started forming alliances against what they saw as a threat to the natural order of English society. The whispers were becoming impossible to ignore. Foreign ambassadors reported back to their courts about the unnatural relationship between the English king and his favorite. Religious leaders began questioning whether James was fit to be the head of the Church of England. The very legitimacy of the monarchy was being called into question because of a love affair that had spiraled completely out of control. The stage was set for a collision between love and politics that would shake the very foundations of the British crown, and James was about to learn that the price of living authentically might be higher than even a king could afford to pay. By 1620, the English court had become a battlefield of jealousy, hatred, and barely contained rage. George Villiers, now Duke of Buckingham, walked through Whitehall Palace like a king himself, while ancient noble families watched their centuries-old influence crumble before the power of a beautiful face and a lonely monarch's desperate heart. The whispers that had once been confined to private chambers now echoed through every corridor, and the scandal was about to explode into open warfare. The established nobility had reached their breaking point. Families like the Howards, the Cecils, and the Herberts had served English kings for generations, building their power through decades of loyal service and political acumen. Now they watched in fury as a 20-something upstart from nowhere wielded more influence than all of them combined. The resentment was poisonous, and it was spreading through every level of English society. The Earl of Somerset, James's previous favorite, had become the most dangerous enemy of all. Once the object of the king's affections, he now found himself completely cast aside, his titles meaningless, his access to royal favor severed by George's arrival. The psychological torment of watching his replacement enjoy everything he had lost was driving Somerset to the edge of madness. He began gathering allies among the displaced courtiers, all of them united by their hatred of the beautiful interloper who had destroyed their world. But the most devastating attacks came from an unexpected source: the Church. Religious leaders who had once praised James as the defender of Protestant England now questioned his moral authority. Sermons began including subtle references to the corruption of natural order and the abomination of unnatural affections. The Archbishop of Canterbury himself struggled with how to address the obvious nature of the king's relationship without directly challenging royal authority. The foreign ambassadors were writing reports that would haunt James for centuries. The Venetian ambassador described court ceremonies where James would caress Buckingham in public with such obvious affection that it scandalizes even the most worldly observers. The Spanish ambassador reported that the king's passion for his favorite has become so consuming that affairs of state are neglected for the pleasure of the Duke's company. The psychological pressure on James was becoming unbearable. The man who had spent his entire life carefully managing his public image now found himself the center of a scandal that threatened to destroy everything he had built. He would fly into violent rages when courtiers failed to show proper respect to George, then sink into deep depressions when forced to confront the political consequences of their relationship. Parliament began making subtle inquiries about the king's expenditures on his favorite. The gifts, estates, and titles James had lavished on George represented a fortune that could have funded entire military campaigns. Questions were being asked about whether the king had the right to bankrupt the crown for personal pleasure. The atmosphere at court had become so toxic that violence seemed inevitable. Duels were fought over perceived slights related to George's rise. Ancient alliances crumbled as families chose sides in what was becoming a civil war within the English aristocracy. The very stability of the kingdom was being threatened by a love affair that had grown beyond all reason and control. But the most dangerous threat was yet to come. Hidden among the enemies gathering against George was a conspiracy so dark and far-reaching that it would ultimately cost lives and change the course of British history forever. In the secret chambers of Whitehall Palace, James was writing letters that would have destroyed him if they had fallen into the wrong hands. These weren't state documents or royal proclamations. These were love letters so passionate, so intimate, so desperately vulnerable that they revealed the true depth of a forbidden relationship that was reshaping the English monarchy. Every word was evidence of treason against the natural order. Every sentence, a potential death warrant for both king and lover. "My sweet child and wife," James wrote to George in 1623, using endearments that would have scandalized the most liberal minds of the age. "I desire only to live in this world for your sake, and that I had rather live banished in any part of the earth with you than live a sorrowful widow's life without you." These weren't the words of a monarch to his subject. These were the desperate confessions of a man who had surrendered his soul to a love that could destroy everything he held dear. The letters reveal a psychological dependency so complete that James had essentially abdicated his emotional sovereignty to George. "I cannot content myself without sending you this present," he wrote during one brief separation, "praying God that I may have a joyful and comfortable meeting with you, and that we may make it this Christmas a new marriage ever to be kept hereafter. The king was fantasizing about a union that could never be acknowledged, a marriage that existed only in the shadowed corners of his desperate heart. But George was playing a far more dangerous game than James realized. While the king poured his soul onto paper, his beloved was using those very emotions as weapons in an increasingly complex web of political intrigue. George had learned that controlling the king's heart meant controlling the kingdom itself, and he was exploiting that power in ways that would have terrified James if he had understood the full scope of his lover's ambitions. The Duke of Buckingham was now essentially running England's foreign policy through pillow talk and intimate conversations. His influence over James was so complete that foreign ambassadors bypassed traditional diplomatic channels and went directly to George to negotiate treaties and alliances. The beautiful young man who had once served wine was now determining the fate of European politics through his ability to manipulate a lonely king's emotions. The psychological manipulation had become so sophisticated that George could predict and control James's emotional responses with frightening precision. A well-timed smile could secure a political appointment. A moment of apparent sadness could redirect royal policy. A whispered endearment could override the Council of Parliament and the Church combined. James had become a puppet, dancing to the emotional strings that only George knew how to pull. But the most terrifying aspect of their relationship was how completely James had surrendered his judgment to his passion. When advisors warned him about George's growing corruption and the political dangers of their obvious intimacy, James would fly into violent rages. "I love the Earl of Buckingham more than anyone else," he declared publicly, "and more than you who are here assembled. Christ had his John, and I have my George." Parliament was beginning to demand George's removal from court. Foreign courts were questioning England's stability under a king who appeared to be controlled by his male lover. Religious leaders were openly questioning James's moral authority to lead the Church of England. The kingdom was fracturing under the weight of a love affair that had grown beyond all reason or restraint. But George's enemies were closing in, and they had found a weakness in his armor that even the king's protection couldn't shield him from. The most dangerous conspiracy in English history was about to unfold, and it would force James to choose between the man he loved and the kingdom he was sworn to protect. By 1625, the enemies of George Villiers had grown from whispered complaints into a coordinated network of hatred that reached the highest levels of English society. Parliament was no longer content with subtle inquiries about royal expenses. They were preparing articles of impeachment against the Duke of Buckingham, charges so serious they could result in his execution. The love that had once seemed like salvation for a lonely king was about to become the weapon that destroyed them both. The conspiracy against George was led by some of the most powerful men in England. The Earl of Bristol, humiliated by George's disastrous Spanish policy, had allied with the Duke of Pembroke and other displaced nobles to orchestrate what amounted to a political assassination. They had spent months gathering evidence of George's corruption, his manipulation of royal policy, and his unprecedented accumulation of wealth and power through his intimate relationship with the king. The charges were devastating in their scope and precision. Parliament accused George of using his sexual influence over James to sell government positions, redirect foreign policy for personal gain, and essentially hold the crown hostage to his emotional manipulation. But the most dangerous accusation was one that couldn't be spoken aloud: that the Duke of Buckingham had corrupted the moral authority of the English monarchy through an unnatural relationship that violated every law of God and nature. James found himself trapped in an impossible position. Defending George meant openly acknowledging the nature of their relationship and the extent of his emotional dependency. But abandoning his beloved would mean destroying the only person who had ever made him feel truly alive. The psychological pressure was so intense that courtiers reported the king was suffering from what appeared to be a complete nervous breakdown. The impeachment proceedings began in earnest in 1626, with Parliament demanding that George be stripped of all titles and banished from England forever. The evidence presented was overwhelming: massive corruption, abuse of royal favor, and a pattern of behavior that had destabilized the entire structure of English government. But everyone understood that the real crime was the love affair itself. the unspoken scandal that had made all the other abuses possible. James's response revealed the true depth of his obsession. Rather than sacrifice George to save his own reign, he chose to dissolve Parliament entirely. The king, who had once prided himself on governing through constitutional means, was now ruling as a dictator to protect his lover from the consequences of their relationship. The decision shocked even his closest advisors and marked the beginning of the constitutional crisis that would ultimately lead to civil war. But the most terrifying realization was dawning on James. George might be using him just as ruthlessly as his enemies claimed. Evidence was mounting that the Duke had been taking bribes from foreign powers, making secret deals that contradicted royal policy, and accumulating wealth through methods that bordered on treason. The beautiful young man who had once seemed like salvation was revealing himself to be something far more calculating and dangerous. The kingdom was fracturing under the weight of their relationship. Scotland was threatening rebellion over policies dictated by George's whims. Parliament was considering unprecedented steps to force the king to remove his favourite. The very foundations of English government were cracking under the pressure of a love affair that had grown beyond all reason or control. As 1627 dawned, James faced the most terrible choice of his life: save his kingdom by destroying the man he loved, or watch everything he had built crumble in defense of a passion that was consuming them both. But George Villiers had his own plans for survival, and they would lead to consequences that neither king nor lover could have imagined. The year 1628 would prove to be the beginning of the end for the most scandalous love affair in royal history. James, now 62, and visibly deteriorating under the psychological strain of defending his beloved against an entire kingdom, was about to face the ultimate test of his devotion. George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, had become so drunk on power and so reckless in his ambitions that even the king's protection could no longer shield him from the consequences of his actions. The breaking point came with George's disastrous military expedition to relieve the siege of La Rochelle in France. What should have been a glorious military victory turned into a humiliating defeat that cost thousands of English lives and drained the royal treasury. The failure was so complete, so obviously the result of George's incompetence and vanity, that even James could no longer deny the truth his enemies had been speaking for years. His beloved was destroying England. Parliament reconvened with blood in their eyes, determined to finish what they had started with the impeachment proceedings. But this time, they had public opinion on their side. The mothers and wives of soldiers who had died for George's glory were demanding justice. The merchants who had seen their trade disrupted by his failed policies were calling for his head. The religious leaders, who had watched him corrupt the moral authority of the crown, were preaching sermons that bordered on open rebellion. The psychological pressure on James was becoming unbearable. For the first time in their relationship, he began questioning whether his love for George was worth the price his kingdom was paying. The sleepless nights, the constant anxiety, the knowledge that his subjects viewed him as a weak king controlled by his lover, all of it was crushing the man who had once been the most respected monarch in Europe. But George, faced with the possibility of losing everything, made a decision that would seal his fate. Instead of accepting responsibility for his failures and seeking the king's forgiveness, he chose to double down on his arrogance. He began making public statements that bordered on threats against Parliament, suggesting that opposition to his policies was tantamount to treason against the crown. The final confrontation came when George demanded that James dissolve Parliament permanently and rule as an absolute monarch. The request revealed the true scope of his ambition. He wanted to transform England into a dictatorship with himself as the power behind the throne. James, despite his overwhelming love, finally understood that granting this wish would destroy not just his own legacy, but the entire constitutional foundation of English government. For the first time in 14 years, James said no to George Villiers. The refusal was so unexpected that George himself seemed stunned. The psychological dynamic that had defined their relationship suddenly shifted. The king had found something more important than his beloved's approval: his responsibility to his people. The rejection triggered something dark in George's personality. The mask of affection finally slipped completely, revealing a man who had never truly loved the king, but had simply used him as a stepping stone to unimaginable power. James felt his heart breaking as he realized the truth he had spent years denying. George Villiers had been playing a role from the very beginning, but even as their relationship crumbled, both men were blind to the greatest danger of all. Among George's many enemies was one who had moved beyond political opposition into the realm of deadly vengeance, and he was preparing to solve the problem of the Duke of Buckingham permanently. The final years of James's reign were marked by a slow psychological disintegration that horrified those who had known him in his prime. By 1624, the king who had once been celebrated as the most learned monarch in Europe was a shadow of his former self, consumed by his dependency on George Villiers and the growing realization that their relationship was destroying everything he had worked to build. The love that had once seemed like salvation was becoming his damnation. The breaking point came not with dramatic confrontation, but with quiet, devastating recognition. As James watched George manipulate foreign policy, sell government positions, and treat the crown as his personal property, something fundamental shifted in the king's understanding of their relationship. The beautiful young man who had seemed to offer genuine love was revealing himself to be something far more calculating and cold. Some historians suggest that James's final months were haunted by the growing suspicion that he had been played from the very beginning. Court observers noted the king's increasing withdrawal from public life, his reluctance to be alone with George, and his apparent inability to make decisions without falling into deep melancholy. The psychological dependency that had defined their relationship was becoming a prison that James seemed powerless to escape. The physical decline was as dramatic as the emotional collapse. James, who had never been robust, began suffering from increasingly severe health problems that his physicians attributed to stress and excessive drinking. He complained of constant pain, sleeplessness, and a profound exhaustion that no amount of rest could cure. Those closest to him understood that the king was dying of something far more complex than kidney failure or arthritis. On March 27, 1625, James died at Theobald's Palace, aged 58. His final words, according to witnesses, were a confused rambling about loyalty, betrayal, and the price of love. The man who had risked everything for an authentic emotional connection had discovered too late that authenticity itself could be performed, that even the most intimate relationships could be weapons in the hands of those clever enough to wield them. George Villiers survived his royal patron by only 3 years. Under the new king, Charles III, his influence waned dramatically, and his enemies finally caught up with him. On August 23, 1628, John Felton stabbed the Duke of Buckingham to death in Portsmouth, ending the life of the man who had manipulated kings and nearly destroyed the English monarchy through the sheer power of his beauty and ambition. The legacy of their relationship extends far beyond the political chaos it created. James and George's love affair represents something profound about the human condition, the eternal tension between our public roles and our private desires, between the lives we're expected to live and the lives our hearts demand we pursue. According to certain controversial interpretations of the surviving evidence, their story reveals the devastating consequences of emotional manipulation on those starved of genuine affection. James's desperate need for love made him the perfect victim for someone who understood that power over the heart is the most dangerous power of all. Many believe that when historians examine the full scope of their relationship, it becomes clear that even in the most restricted societies, love finds a way to exist, but not always in the pure form we imagine. Sometimes love is corrupted by ambition, twisted by manipulation, and destroyed by the very intensity that makes it irresistible. If their story has moved you, if it's made you think about the courage it takes to love authentically in a world full of hidden agendas, then subscribe to join me as we continue exploring history's most complex human relationships. Because every generation faces James's choice, whether to risk everything for connection, even when that connection might destroy us.